part of the military. But honestly, I think that there have been other events that have just so overtaken Benghazi at this point, the IRS being one of them, that frankly, I don't hear anybody even talking about Benghazi as much as they're talking about the IRS stuff, which is something I think a lot more people can relate to. We all pay taxes, or we're all supposed to pay taxes anyway. So I think that is a sort of an investigative issue on the Hill is really in retreat, and the IRS is in ascension.
Charles?
Look, there are three episodes here. There's the before the attack, during the attack, and after. All of the attention started with after the attack with the talking points. And now there's been a hell of a lot of focus ever since we had the testimony of Gregory Hicks, who was on the scene of the during of the attack and before, the lack of preparation. Clearly, the dereliction before, clearly, I don't know about lying, but deception, intentional or otherwise, after. But the real story, the one that I think is most untold, and could be the worst in the end, is what happened during those 8 hours. And specifically, we've heard so little where the president was and what he was doing. The one thing that we do know that's never raised is that he spent an hour on the phone that night, early in the evening, with the Prime Minister of Israel, because a story had broken in Israel that Obama was sort of dissing the Israelis by refusing a meeting with Netanyahu at the UN upcoming the next week. And remember, it's in the middle of an election, and they're very sensitive because the Jerusalem story, which had been dropped and had been an issue just a week earlier at the Democratic Convention. So they spent an hour on the phone. That's a long time. And then immediately the White House has a long readout of that, what they were saying to each other. And in fact emphasizes that there was no invitation and no snubbing of invitation of the president to the prime minister. So that was clearly the objective of that. Covering himself on a political issue in the middle of an 8-hour event that involved the deaths of 4 Americans under essentially Obama's command. Now that, to me, is absolutely remarkable. And where was Obama at the beginning? Where was he at the end? When did he go to bed? Did he show any interest? What orders did he give? Did anybody contradict his orders? We know nothing about that. That, to me, if there is a dereliction of the commander-in-chief in the middle of a fight where Americans are dying, that is potentially the worst of all the scandals.
Steve, to wrap this up, we have much more on this Friday at 10 p.m. As we lay out a new timeline to kind of put it all together. Actually, that's really where this thing gets interesting. When you lay it all out for somebody and you say, here's what happened here, here's what happened here, and you kind of put it all together, it seems like, just laying out the facts, it seems like people understand it a little bit better. Otherwise, you get little pieces, and it's just not. I don't think the press are ever going to cover it. Do you, Susan?
No, Steve is more on this than I am.
No, I don't think the press will cover it, but we have to remember the press is an interested party here, because when this first happened, in the hours after this happened, and the days after this happened, there was an I would say obsessive focus on Mitt Romney and his comments about this, and very little actual real reporting on what had happened in Benghazi, where the president was. All of these things, in effect, went unanswered, maybe unasked. And so the press from that point on basically declined to cover this in any great detail. So to ask them to cover it now, in effect, would be making them acknowledge that their lack of coverage before was a mistake. So they basically come to a conclusion that this was not newsworthy. So to get them to cover it now, I think, is an extra hurdle. But you're exactly right that laying it out in some detail, and when you do that to people, regardless of their views on the Obama administration or their views on Benghazi in particular, it's a compelling story. And Charles, I think, hits on one of the many very interesting and as yet unresolved questions. What was the president doing? We've gotten basically a minute-by-minute timeline of what he was doing on the night that Osama bin Laden was killed. It's been depicted in movies. We've had detailed stories about this. We know everything the president was doing, but aside from that one phone call and one brief photo taken in the Oval Office at, I think, about 7:30, we don't know what the president was doing. We do know, however, that he did go the next morning to Las Vegas for this fundraiser. So that may give some hint as to how seriously he was taking this the night before.
Last thing on this, Steve. We know from Secretary Panetta, he meets with the president at 5 p.m. with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the Oval Office. And they talk about the attack, and apparently, according to Panetta, the president says, do all you can with the DOD to respond to this. Right. Available DOD assets to respond to it. That's how Panetta says it. So why then doesn't it happen?
That's the big disconnect. I think that's exactly how the White House would respond to the charges that Charles is making. They would say, look, the president said do everything.
Then why doesn't it happen?
That's the big disconnect. We don't know. I mean, this was one of the questions that I think members of Congress thought that Carter Ham might be able to give some detail on today in his testimony. I think that was one of the hopes going into this, was that he was going to be able to lay out some of these things. I think he'd said in other discussions that he'd had with people, he had shed some light on that. So I think they were hopeful that he would come back and share some additional information on the decision making both before, during, and after.
There's one other data point. Obama and Hillary Clinton, the then Secretary of State, have a phone call around at 10 p.m. on that night. And when she was asked about it in Congress in her testimony, I believe it was January 23, she was asked about that, and she was asked about the content. She said, and this is roughly as I remember it, what was it about? She informed the president and kept him abreast of developments. He is the commander-in-chief, and he's learning about this instead of being on this every second. And he's learning about it from the Secretary of Defense. We know that he did not speak. He learns about it from the Secretary of State. We know he did not speak that night subsequently with the Secretary of Defense or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He's the Commander-in-Chief. He plays the Commander-in-Chief on all kinds of other issues, the drones, the bin Laden raid, and on this, he's being informed by Secretary of State at 10 p.m. like he's a bystander.
Susan, again, much more on this, 10 p.m. on Friday. Susan, okay, the president is en route to Africa, getting ready for this trip, and obviously all of these things, these investigations are still kind of plaguing this administration, at least sucking the oxygen out of the room here in Washington. Meantime, you have Nelson Mandela, who is not doing well. What about this trip?
Well, I think it would have looked so bad to cancel the trip at this point. I mean, that's part of the problem, is that, you still have to go on with the business of being the president. For that matter, even being a candidate, I'm less bothered by the Las Vegas trip than I am about just questions about what was actually going on during and what he was doing. But you cancel the trip, the diplomatic import of that is pretty bad. And then all you're really doing is saying that your government is falling apart. You don't want to give that impression. Part of the problem with a lot of this IRS stuff is that, there are two arenas where people need to feel absolutely certain they're being treated equally, and one is with taxes and the other is with voting. And I think a lot of people are feeling very, very unsettled about that. I mean, everybody always feels sort of unfairly targeted with taxes in one way or the other, don't we all? Especially with the revelations recently that there were other groups that were called progressive that were also targeted, although maybe not as closely scrutinized as the ones that had Tea Party in them. Now you have the Inspector General's press secretary saying that they were only asked to look at what they did with Tea Party groups. It just creates this whole sense that you don't know what the IRS is doing, and are they treating people fairly. And the thing is, Steve, you brought up a really good point of how the press was covering the Benghazi thing, is that there's this tendency to just write about these things in terms of how they're affecting somebody's popularity or the politics as opposed to the actual substance of it. And one thing that I think has been lost in this IRS scandal is that these are all groups on the left and the right that were asking for special treatment from the government. They weren't selected for harassment with audits. They were asking for special treatment. They were asking for tax-exempt status. And I'm sorry, if you have Tea Party in your name or progressive in your name, you probably are a political group. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're not a social welfare group. And all of that, I think, has gotten lost. And the public integrity, or excuse me, the public faith in the IRS is really, really dropping, and that's potentially devastating, not just for this administration, but just for how we run our government.
Charles?
I think there's a really important point of what you're saying having to do with how obsessed we are with the political effect of stuff. In the immigration debate, instead of people talking about what would be best for the country, how do we solve the problem, how do we prevent, another wave in all this, every time you get an amendment, can you get enough Republicans? Is this going to do it? Who can you get on this? Which is essentially...
Well, have a good day, guys. I just wanted to update you on the Benghazi. Bye-bye.